We know from the statistics that there are neighborhoods that deal with a disproportionate amount of violence. And with the Fall Crime Prevention Initiative, we will target 5 of those neighborhoods.
And what I'm asking is that the system, the ecosystem, our justice system, does its part in terms of making sure that these folks are held accountable. I'm asking community members, join with me. If you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, join with me. My voice is only but one voice, and I've been saying this for a long time.
Hello, I'm Tom Jackman, a criminal justice reporter at the Washington Post. And today we're going to look at a problem that is affecting many major cities in America, rising crime, often violent crime. Our focus today will be in our own backyard of Washington, D.C. And my guests are the 8th mayor of Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, Muriel Bowser, and the city's police chief, Robert Contee. Welcome, both of you, to Washington Post Live.
Thanks, Tom.
We've got a lot of questions from viewers, but let me start with a couple myself. Mayor Bowser, as we saw in that intro, homicides are up over 12% compared to last year, which was a bad year. But to be fair, violent crime, which includes murder, sexual abuse, aggravated assault, robbery, is only up 2%. And last year, violent crime was actually down 4% in the district. Still, homicides are the most drastic of crimes and what can create a sense of fear among citizens. And this is true in almost every big city these days. Mayor Bowser, do you have a sense of why we're seeing this here? And in your discussions with other mayors and police chiefs, is there anything different or unique happening here in the district?
Well, certainly we don't want any amount of crime, and certainly violent crime, gun crime, or homicide in our city. And we approach it certainly from a comprehensive way to address the causes of violence, provide opportunities and more opportunity programs for our residents, but also enforce our laws. And so when we approach the prevention of crime and the enforcement of lawlessness in that way, we know that we'll be able to drive down the numbers. You ask about what's happening nationally, and I can't point to a single thing. I don't think any mayor can, or any person who's researching crime can. Certainly, we know that the global pandemic has affected our cities and towns and people in ways that are yet to be fully determined. Yes, mayors all over the country are talking about it. You probably know that I was at the White House with the president talking about how the federal government can partner with us to make sure that we have everything possible to address rises in violent crime. And it's the gun crime, as you note, that we're particularly worried about.
I get it. And so, Chief Contee, we turn to you with sort of a similar question. I did want to ask you this. So you became a police officer in 1992. Do you know how many homicides there were in the city that year?
I don't recall that year specifically, but I would say probably somewhere over 400 would be my guess.
That's correct. 443. It was the fourth of 5 straight years of more than 430 murders. But 20 years later, in 2012, there were 88 homicides in the district. So now we're headed back up again, but I think that shows that you can have an impact, that the murder rate can be driven down. We're heading, so I guess what I wonder is what worked back then, what leading up to 2012, where we saw such a drastic drop, and will that work again now? And I also want you to revisit the question of why, but you're putting on your criminologist and your police chief hat. Why are we seeing the raise, and what works to drive homicide rates down in the district?
Yeah, I would just really echo what the mayor said in terms of, the reasons behind this. I talk to police chiefs all around the country, almost daily. And in those discussions, as we talk about, the things that are happening, the things that are consistent that I hear, gun being a common denominator, and accountability or lack thereof, office also being one of the common denominators that I hear. So I think that that's something that we have to look at when we talk about the justice system, the ecosystem that is responsible for holding violent criminals accountable. You go back to what happened, back, some years ago. There was a lot of incarceration that happened, and I'm not suggesting that that is the answer to all of our problems by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, we had people going to jail for low-level drug offenses and for long periods of time and so forth. And I think that during that time, if you look at our incarceration rate, it was probably through the roof. We lock a lot of people up every year, but I think it's one of those things where you really have to look at this holistically. It's not just law enforcement. It's not just program. You can't arrest your way out of the situation. You can't program your way out of it. I think it's something that you really have to tackle from both ends of the rope to really try to find the sweet spot, if you will, to reduce violent crime in any major city.
Mayor Bowser, I know you've been asked this before. Defund the police was a reaction that we heard a lot starting last year to police violence. Very few big city mayors support that, but it was an expression of, impatience and rage about watching citizens being victimized. How do we change police besides defunding them if we need to?
Well, sure. And so let me be clear. I was not a supporter of a defund movement in the city, and certainly wasn't supportive of any police investments being reduced in our city, especially when we already saw kind of ticks up of crime and some things that we were concerned about. Nonetheless, that was what happened with our budget. And we experienced a year where we weren't able to do any hiring, and that's not good. So I think that we had a net loss with attrition of about 300 officers. Good for us that this year I moved an emergency funding measure through the council, which is going to allow us to hire 200 officers this year. That still won't make up for what we lost, but it will get us back on the right track of where we need to be. The truth is that law enforcement is not ever going to be the only answer to a public safety issue like we're experiencing right now. So we've also invested $59 million, largely supported by the American Rescue Plan, that will allow us to try some non-law enforcement interventions, including hiring more than 50 new and 50 additional violence interrupters that will work for trusted community partners and be out in neighborhoods to try to prevent crime before it happens. We're investing in a pilot that will provide housing vouchers for people who are involved in our public safety programs. And we think that if they have safe and stable housing and may be out of the environment where they've been involved in crime, that we'll also see a better outcomes. And we're also always looking at ways to evolve our police department. Listen, MPD has been involved in evolution since the 90s, where we've professionalized our force, we've trained our officers, we've equipped. I think we were probably among the first big cities to equip our officers with body-worn camera that hold everybody involved accountable. And we have an independent police complaints board. So you won't hear any of us, and especially the police chief, saying that we aren't always looking for ways to improve our department. The officers can't do their work without the trust of the community. The community cannot have safety without the officers. So we recognize that every day we invest in that police and community trust.
You mentioned violence interrupters, and I think there's maybe a couple of different programs of that going on in the city. have you seen any positive results? I don't know, not even sure you could measure it, but do you have a sense that that's something that can work?
Well, like I said, we try everything that has demonstrated some effectiveness, whether here or in other places in the city, I mean, and in the country. And to be honest with you, we're always evolving our violence interruptions programs too. They're fairly new. We're working on about 5 years of experience with those programs, making sure we have the right teams, the right approaches, and the right ways to measure their progress. So my answer to you would be, we feel like we need more time to see how effective they can be as part of our public safety ecosystem.
Chief Contee, your police staffing is down to its lowest point in 20 years. Is it necessarily true that fewer cops equal more crime, or that more cops equal less crime?
I think it'll be a hard case to try to make, quite frankly. But from the vantage point that I have, the district's population, we're over 700,000. I mean, that's significant for our city. If you look at, the last 15 to 20 years, the population in the District of Columbia, it continues to grow. Clearly, in my mind, with that increased population, we are obviously a tourist attraction for the entire world. And while we have been or we have reopened, but in times of COVID, when we see reduced amounts of people in the District of Columbia, there's still people in our city that require the services of the Metropolitan Police Department. Clearly, that is not the time where we want to see reduction in force, where we see crimes that are happening, violent crimes specifically, that make people feel unsafe. So much like it's very hard to measure sometimes the effectiveness of violence interrupters, like you mentioned, right? How do we know how many crimes don't occur because of the presence of police officers? We really don't know that. We don't know of the shootings or the homicides that don't occur because of the presence of police officers. But what we do know is that when residents don't see police officers out in community, they feel unsafe when that's the case. So I think it's something that is really kind of hard to get to, but I'd rather have police officers in community. And quite frankly, when I talk to most residents, they want to see their police officers in their community.
And
So
Chief, you raised
Go ahead.
because another thing that we're always looking at, Tom, is where our residents are calling for us, and they're calling 911. And we can look at over the years, and the chief has already mentioned how our population has increased, our business population has increased, the places where people go for dining and work and recreation, all of those things have increased, which means our calls for service, people dialing 911 saying they need help, have also gone up. And so we're committed. Our residents expect when they call 911 to have a professional show up, whether it's fire and EMS or our police officers, and that we don't experience a lengthening of the time it takes for us to respond to them. And all of those are important in a city that's grown like ours. Listen, that you referenced the 90s. I grew up in D.C. in the 90s. Chief Contee grew up in D.C. in the 90s. So we have experienced what backsliding to a culture of violence could look like in our town. Our commitment to transforming our city, it kind of starts and ends with our commitment to keeping our neighborhoods safe, and making sure that we have the best schools and the best amenities of any big city in America. And that's what our focus is. But we have to have the public servants to address the needs of our residents, visitors, and workers, to be able to maintain that kind of experience for DC.
All right, we've got questions from our readers, or as we say here on Washington Post Live, our viewers. And so the first one is from Lee Eliav of the district, who asks, what are you doing to curb violence in the city, especially the violence occurring at parks and playgrounds? You want to take that one, Chief?
Sure, absolutely. A number of things in that space. Obviously, deployment of personnel is essential, and we want to make sure when we talk about places where our children are playing, where my child is playing, going to a rec center or going just to the neighborhood park, those are locations where we want to make sure that we not just have police working in those neighborhoods, but we're also partnering with members in the community or just local folks who are also part of the overall law enforcement strategy. Right now, we talked about the violence interrupters. We have individuals from the Mayor's Building Blocks Initiative that we work closely with in the space of gun violence prevention to try to make sure that we are doing everything that we possibly can to make communities safer. On the law enforcement side specifically, we started our community-focused patrol units, which are officers specifically on mountain bikes and scooters that are working in community where they can engage community, where community members can see that police presence and hopefully feel safer as a result of that police presence. We're still continuing to recover firearms, illegal firearms off the streets of the District of Columbia. So far this year, we've surpassed where we were this time last year. We've recovered over 1,800 illegal firearms off the streets of the District of Columbia. And that's because our officers are out there working in the spaces and places where there are playgrounds and children that are out there or community members that are just out there enjoying the space. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on within the Metropolitan Police Department to really stay focused on that. Our carjacking task force, that comes to mind. An initiative that we started, our Novian Investigations Unit that we started with the ATF, really all focused on reducing gun violence in our city. Those are just some of the initiatives, to name a few, that we have working to make residents feel safer and reduce gun violence in our city.
You remind me, I've written a number of stories about ghost guns, which are guns which are assembled by people without serial numbers, and you guys keep finding more and more of them. Chief, is that something that can be addressed somehow? I mean, finding them is one thing, but stopping them from getting made is another. Is there approaches that can handle that?
Yeah, well, I would say it's a step further than that. It's holding the people accountable when we do catch them with them, right? We know what the intentions are for individuals who are in possession of these types of guns. And, when we have, in our city, individuals who get arrested with these types of firearms, and you see that they were released because of COVID or something like that. I mean, that's just unacceptable is the bottom line. If we want to make sure that we have a safe city, then it requires a reimagination, if you will, of the entire ecosystem that has that responsibility to make sure that not only are the police officers arresting the right people, getting the right guns out of the wrong hands, but when we do bring those individuals into custody, that they are being detained as they should be and not back out in community where they make communities unsafe.
Mayor Bowser, we saw a thing in the intro about a fall anti-crime initiative, but I think you had one for the summer, which I thought had a lot of interesting approaches, targeting specific neighborhoods, other social calming devices. Did you get any, now that we're at the end of the summer, did you get any kind of feedback on whether or not that was effective or had any impact?
It is effective. And we have been, the chief will tell me how many years we've been doing summer crime initiatives, but they're very effective for a lot of reasons. We do see violent crime driven down. The chief taps a up and coming captain to give the captain the responsibility for a concentrated area. The chief deploys overtime as needed and just really floods the area with resources. The officers are also tasked with not just being in community to make arrests, but being in community to do events and walk the blocks, get to know neighbors and get to know leaders. It is a very intense use of resources. Earlier in the summer, you might have noticed that I authorized the chief to use as much overtime as he needed and deploy across the city. Now I say that because we can make the dollars and cents available because we'll move them around from other priorities in the city. But it's difficult to tax our officers in that way. So overtime is never really unlimited because we're dealing with a human resource, and we need people to be fresh and ready to make good decisions. This is a dangerous job that they have, and we need them fresh and able to make good decisions. But having said that, there are also crime trends that evolve in the fall. And they may be different. They may actually be different patterns. And so the chief took a fresh look in September at the areas that could benefit from that infusion of people resources.
Let's take another question
And if I
from
could just
a viewer.
if I could just add
Go ahead.
to that too. So for the summer crime initiative, to the mayor's point, we experienced double-digit reductions in violent crime as well as property crime in the areas that were selected for the summer crime initiative. This is actually the second year that we've done the fall crime initiative, and we're equally looking for success. It's a tough time, right? Because as we look at the analysis, it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison, right? For example, you look at some locations that we've chosen to focus on, and let's say an area like Columbia Heights, where you have the Target store and a lot of businesses up there. During when we were at the peak of COVID, some of those businesses were closed last year. While we have a comparison this year when these businesses are open, and you see increasing levels like in auto thefts or theft from autos as an example, and when you see some of those increasing levels. But we are up for the challenge. The captains are committed to the area. They're out there to engage the communities and suppress crime in the process of our engagement. So, we're into it, and right now we are seeing some reductions in our violent crime. We're still struggling a bit in the property crime area, but at the end of this, I really expect to see some positive results.
All right, let's take another question from a viewer. Joshua Lopez of the district asks, what are your plans to work around the D.C. Council's obstruction of MTD's request to hire more officers? I think you should take that one first, Mayor Bowser. What are your plans?
Well, this is my job, Tom. My job is to tell the council and to tell the people what we need. And I don't care what the political winds are, which way they're blowing. My job is to tell, when the police chief tells me what he needs, my job is to go to the council and work to get those resources. And, we didn't get them in the regular course of the budget, but we came back later, and I'm proud to say that we got much of what we asked for hiring for the current year. But it's a bigger question, I think, that's asked because there's kind of a ideological disagreement, I think. And it is fine, and we are fully engaged with a commission that the council created to look at the police force. We don't agree with all of their recommendations, but we are certainly willing to work on ways that have been identified to increase trust among police and community.
What's happening with the crime lab? So the crime lab was decertified earlier this year. The gun unit within the crime lab was disbanded. And also the 911 center recently got an audit which said that they were not always so reliable at dispatching folks to the right addresses. Are these things that still that trouble you guys and that you're doing something about?
Well, I'm troubled by the issue with the crime lab for a lot of reasons, and that's a complicated discussion, probably for another setting. But let me say this: this city committed to having an independent crime lab some years ago, more than 10 years ago, and sometimes that independence doesn't sit well with all of the partners in the criminal justice system. And so we think that the kind of back and forth that we have had, for example, United States Attorney's Office, may be a recurring thing and just kind of intrinsic to having a independent crime lab. So what I've asked my team to do, because I don't want to kind of do this again, is to really look at our law in DC, and that created an independent crime lab, and have an honest discussion with all of the partners, and create a system that everybody can support. And that's where we are with the lab. And I couldn't really be prouder of the work that we have done with our 911 call center. When I became mayor, we hadn't hired any new call takers in 9 years. And our employees were among the most stressed in all of DC government. And since then, we've been able to pour in investments with new people and training, and work with their customers who are MPD and fire and EMS. And is with any agency like that, they're always looking for ways to improve their processes in coordination with our agencies.
Here's another question from a viewer. This is from Laverne Dawkins of DC. Laverne asks, why isn't there more input from the youth? What do they feel needs to be done to have a safer and better community to live in?
So
I think go ahead, Chief.
Yes, ma'am. I will jump in there. I think that's a very valid question. You know, I talk to the youth in our community all the time. As a matter of fact, I'm restructuring my youth advisory council. I'm restructuring. We have a citizens advisory council and a chiefs advisory council that's pretty much made up of adults. Well, I'm restructuring a program that we have in the Metropolitan Police Department to have a youth advisory council, young people, to advise me on issues. Right now, I get that from going around our city, the chats with the chief, talking to our young police cadets that are born and raised here in Washington, D.C., many of them. So I kind of get it through those different veins, if you will. But to really have something formal, I'm working on that. Our youth advisory council to advise the chief of police on matters pertaining to youth. I think it is an incredibly important issue. And you know, to quote a friend of mine, you know, in order for us to get closest to the problem, we got to get closest to the pain. And when we get close to the pain, a lot of times you see things through a different lens that, you know, sometimes some people just don't see because it's not their lived experience. You know, even from the time when I grew up in the city and the mayor grew up in the city, you know, some of the challenges that our young people are dealing with, you know, just a very simple one. The issues that they deal with the pressures around social media. You know, the mayor and I, we didn't have social media really as an issue back in our time growing up, but that's very real. It's very present in the lives of our young people. Sometimes it leads to violence in our city, and that is a fact. So I think it's a very valid question. It's something that I'm working on, and I'm sure the mayor has tons of other ways on her side that she's hearing from the young people in our city.
You want to jump in on that, Mayor Bowser?
I mean, I think you asked the perfect question, actually, because kids, they are growing up in a different time, but they're very smart. They see a lot, and they do have a lot of opinions and recommendations if you ask. And I also think that, you know, even when we are in our most challenging environments, kids are kids, and they want opportunities, they want to live, they want to be safe, and some of them are really scared. Now there are other young people in our community that have been so traumatized or have been so neglected and haven't been exposed to the types of opportunities in our city that they need very serious interventions. And that's one reason why I've been so focused on getting kids back in school. Through this pandemic, we sent our kids home. Our teachers did an incredible job. But when kids are separated from school, then they don't have those trusted adults. They don't have the school counselors, the nurses, and the mental health professionals that are in all of our buildings that can help us figure out when a kid needs help. And sometimes that help prevents a kid from being a perpetrator of violence or a victim of violence. And that's why connecting schools, it really can't be we can't underestimate the impact of these COVID closures on a lot of things that are happening across our city.
I've got one for Chief Contee. In the discussions about police reform and progressive prosecution policies, crime victims often feel left out and sometimes harmed by new initiatives which they feel focus on the rights of defendants. Why is that? Why should victims suffer? If you think they do, uh, is there harm to crime victims when we change these kind of policies of prosecutions and arrest?
I absolutely believe that there's an impact. I got an email from a dad the other day whose son was shot and killed by an errant round that was meant for someone else, shot and killed his son. And now that individual is going to be able to plead to a charge of manslaughter. And the dad was conveying to me that this person, had this person committed a carjacking, they probably would receive more time than this person is going to get for killing his son. And he was very upset about that. And I don't think that a lot of times the victims, the survivors and victims' perspectives are taken into account. And that's just my personal view. I've been doing this for a long time, and I would say, if you look at the last 18, 19, 20 months, what has been introduced, what have we talked about that really is in support of our victims of crime? What have we talked about? What new thing that we've talked about when it comes to holding people accountable that really kind of take our victims and survivors and really take their perspectives into account? I haven't seen it. It's just my personal view. And I know that there are a lot of families out there that are feeling that because I talked to them personally. Unfortunately, with the 184 homicides that we've had so far this year, a lot of those scenes, I'm standing over top of their loved one and having conversations with those families of those loved ones that were lost. And they oftentimes feel, as these cases, as they move through the process, they often feel very much left out.
Here's a question from Jesselyn Walker of the city. In what ways are citizens able to assist in identifying what makes us feel safe in D.C.? How can people help?
Yeah, I think that communicating with the police, that's important. I've held several chats with the chiefs where we've done these virtual meetings, even in a COVID environment, where I want to connect with the community. Just yesterday, I was out walking several communities in our city, in Ward 4, in Ward 5, and Ward 6, really just trying to connect with residents to hear. I had a meeting with another a business group the other day, and one thing that came out of that, sometimes the things that we intend on the law enforcement side, that we intend to make community members feel safe, in their eyes or through the lens that they're looking, it doesn't necessarily achieve the desired outcome. For example, in a conversation that I recently had in one of our business corridors, we were talking about the presence of police and the officers in the area, and they got their lights going. And our intention is to make residents feel safe because they can say, hey, look, we see the police. Some of the business owners in that area say, well, hey, through our lens, sometimes people think that they just missed a shooting or that something happened in the block. So it's not necessarily making people feel safer. So I think through dialogue and conversation and engagement, you really kind of get a better understanding and a better lens of how people are viewing, what the police are doing. And that I think that's very informative for community members, that we communicate what it is we're trying to achieve, and perhaps through that communication you get a better outcome when there's understanding of what we're really trying to do to make communities feel safer.
Here's a question from a reader that I think might have been aimed at Chief Contee, but I would be interested to hear Mayor Bowser's thoughts on it as well. It's from Ariadna Alvarado, who asks, why don't you resume the old tradition of community foot patrols, especially in sensitive and busy areas? It does help to reduce and prevent violence and can certainly improve partnership, build trust, and enhance community engagement while facilitating relationship building between police officers and members of the community. You remember the days when the police walked the beat, Mayor Bowser?
That's today. Police walk the beat. So this is for Chief Contee, because if when I hear neighbors say that as if it's from a bygone era, I am concerned. And I know the chief will be concerned because police should be walking the beats. And I've heard it enough to know that we have work to do. That we want our residents to know their officers and know their lieutenants. They're responsible for public safety in that area. We've invested in bikes. I think we even invested in electric bikes so that we're getting more. And my expectation is that the new hiring that we're doing, those will be officers that will go on bikes and on foot before they go in cars. And so that's hugely important. We don't want our residents to only see the police when there's a problem, because that neighbor is not going to call if there is a real problem and they can help with with a witness statement to help us keep a neighborhood safe or hold someone accountable. So I agree with your caller, and we're going to continue to identify ways to make sure that the officers are meeting our expectation of being on the street and talking to people.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, it's just one of the reasons why we started our community-focused patrol that I mentioned earlier, and we'll continue to expand that as new recruits come out of the academy. You know, and as the mayor mentioned, I mean, that's very important. It's very important to me that we have that level of engagement. One of the things that we've done in the interim is really kind of focused our efforts to do more hotspot policing as opposed to fixed areas. And the difference there is, so as an officer who's assigned to a cruiser, for example, whatever street, you know, if this beat is part of the area and there's a problem area, you know, they will now park the cars in the community in a block every hour, get out, walk that area for about 15 minutes back to the car, because the other piece that we're trying to balance with the shrinking workforce is the response to calls for service. And as the mayor talked about this at the very top, we're still responding to over 600,000 calls a year for service. So, you know, we still got to get to those calls, but we still have to be present in the community, and you got to have the people to do that. So as we continue to hire people, my intention is to expand the community focused patrol unit to make sure that not just the patrol officers who are assigned to the districts out there, but we have a force of officers that are mobile, engaged, and those officers on mountain bike, as the mayor mentioned, without e-bikes as those come in, they still have the capacity to be able to respond and be engaged in the community on foot, on bike, and I think that is important. So thank that viewer for that question. That was an excellent one. Thank you.
Well, let's take one more from the viewers, which is from Matthew Sullivan, who asks, what is the penalty for using a gun that is not licensed, and how can we stop gun violence in D.C.?
Yeah, the penalty, I wish it was you know, more than what it is, but it starts out you know, as a misdemeanor offense pretty much, and individuals you know, I would, you know, challenge Matthew, if you go to look to see, you know, what accountability looks like in terms of you know, how much time or incarceration a person does for possession of a firearm in the District of Columbia. First offense, you know, probably time served, some type of probation. Second offense, you know, maybe some months or something like that, less than a year. But I think that the residents of the District of Columbia, at least through the conversations that I have, they have a greater expectation than what we're doing right now. And I think that that's something that we need to look at as a city to determine whether or not those penalties actually measure up to what residents' expectations are. How do you end gun violence? That's a great question. I think we're trying to figure that out all across the country. But I will say this, when you talk about illegal guns and people who use them, they can't commit those crimes with those illegal weapons if they're not on the streets.
And the other thing, Chief, that I think is important to note, sometimes, a lot of times, residents can't see MPD working. And the chief has been very focused on how to increase intelligence-led policing efforts, the partnerships with the other federal law enforcement agencies that are focused on crime. And that has allowed, I think, I'm going to brag on them a little bit, to get to guns before they can be used, and to get higher up on the kind of the crime food chain of people who are coordinating this gun and drug activity in our city. So we're always going to be out there blanketing the city with patrol officers and maintaining a presence, but also inside, there are very smart policing strategies being used to deal with, the higher ups and the kind of the crime food chain, and to get to guns before they get in the hands of people who will use them.
Mayor Bowser, COVID-19 caused many people to lose their jobs, disrupted transportation, led to greater isolation, and a spike in crime in some areas. What's been the overall impact of COVID on the city in terms of safety and violence? And do you think that it will improve as COVID declines?
Well, I think as I said at the top, it's hard to pinpoint any one thing for the cause of increase in gun crime. But I certainly think the city getting back to normal will help everything from people being back to their normal employment, normal volumes of people in parks and on streets and on the trains. I frankly believe all of those things will help improve the public safety environment. I also know for sure that what we've experienced has largely been concentrated in areas that have experienced, have the brunt of gun crime. And the focus that MPD and our building blocks initiatives and our pathways initiative that are helping people get employed, and our violence interruption initiatives. We think that all of those things combine, and actually COVID, or the funds that came from the federal government because of COVID, have allowed us to make really historic investments in all of those areas. So the experience with COVID and the federal relief that came with it may, at the end of the day, allow us to see what public safety and non-law enforcement interventions are working.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us, Mayor Bowser and Police Chief Contee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And as always, thank you for watching. Check out what interviews we have coming up. It's always an amazing list of guests. Please head to WashingtonPostLive.com to register and find more information about all of our upcoming programs. Have a good day.